It started with the wind, cold, sharp and restless. It swept through the pines that bordered the small town of Millhaven, Maine, on the last night of October, 1893. The townsfolk would remember that wind for generations. It wasn't just a chill in the air, they said, but something darker. It howled down the old main street, rattling shutters and whispering through the cracks of candle-lit homes, as if trying to warn them of what was about to come. At the very edge of town, hidden behind a field of dying corn and skeletal birch trees, stood the Crowe family farm. The house itself looked ancient even then, tilted slightly to one side, its roof patched with mismatched shingles, the front porch sagging under the weight of time. Inside that house lived the Crowes: Henry, a stern but loving father; Margaret, a soft-spoken mother who sang as she cooked; little Samuel, only 7, and their eldest, Eliza. Eliza was 11 that autumn. An intelligent, quiet girl, her teachers often said she was too serious for her age. Most days you could find her reading near the barn or sketching the crows that circled the fields at dusk. She was drawn to them, no one quite knew why. The old preacher used to joke that the birds followed her like she was their queen. Eliza would only smile at that, a small, strange smile that made people shift uncomfortably. The town of Millhaven had few stories worth remembering before that Halloween. But by the morning of November 1st, there would be only one name on everyone's lips: Eliza Crowe. It began early in the evening, when Margaret Crowe sent her children to gather kindling out by the woodpile. The sun had almost dipped below the hills, painting the sky in streaks of burnt orange and violet. The wind had grown wilder, setting the windmill behind the barn spinning in erratic, mournful creaks. Little Samuel complained that it sounded like someone crying. Eliza laughed, an odd breathy sound, and told him it was only the wind. But Samuel insisted he saw something near the tree line. "It's a woman," he whispered. "She's calling my name." Eliza turned, searching the shadows beyond the cornfield, but there was only the wind, carrying the rattling of dried leaves and the distant bark of dogs. She told her brother to go inside. He didn't move. When she grabbed his arm, she felt how cold he was, terribly cold. Inside the house, Margaret was setting the table when Eliza came in alone. "Where's Samuel?" her mother asked. Eliza just stared at her, her hands trembling slightly, bits of dry leaves tangled in her hair. "He went out back," she said simply, "to follow someone." The kerosene lamp flickered. Margaret hurried outside, calling for her son, but the darkness had swallowed him whole. Henry returned from the town square a short while later, his lantern swinging in the wind, shouting for his wife and son. He didn't notice at first that Eliza was standing out in the field, motionless, her dress rippling like a pale ghost in the night. By the time he reached her, she turned to him slowly and said words he never forgot. She said they're better off in the dark. When dawn broke, the Crowe farm was silent. The neighbors who came looking for the family found the front door open, the breakfast table untouched, and the air inside heavy with the smell of burnt wood and iron. The only living thing they found was Eliza, sitting on the front steps, her hands blackened, her face smeared with soot. She looked up at them with an expression they could never decipher, half sorrow, half serenity, and whispered, "It's quiet now." Word spread quickly through Millhaven. Some said it was an accident, that the lamp had fallen and started a fire. The others said Eliza had gone mad. But there were things that didn't fit, like the fact that her father and mother weren't burned but bludgeoned, or that Samuel's small footprints led out to the cornfield and stopped abruptly, as if he had vanished into the ground. The sheriff didn't know what to make of it. The only witness was the girl herself. In the days that followed, Eliza refused to speak of what happened that night. She didn't cry, didn't ask for her family. When the town doctor examined her, he asked if she remembered the fire. Her eyes fixed on the grey sky outside the window, and she said softly, "They wanted to go." The woman said she'd take them where it's always night. The court didn't know what to do with her. She was too young to hang, too dangerous to keep. Eventually they sent her to the state asylum in Augusta, a place reserved for the lost and the unwanted. The press called her the Little Demon of Millhaven, but the locals called her something else, the Crowe Girl. Decades would pass before anyone spoke her name again. The farmhouse rotted away and the cornfield grew wild. Hunters said they could hear children laughing out there on cold October nights. Others claimed they saw a small girl walking along the edge of the woods, her face pale in the moonlight, always whispering the same 3 words, "It's quiet now." But the truth of what happened on that Halloween night was buried with the ashes of the Crowe family. At least that's what everyone believed, until one journalist, nearly a century later, decided to uncover the truth behind the legend of Eliza Crowe. And what he found would make the people of Mill Haven wish the story had stayed forgotten. He arrived in town on a rainy afternoon, the kind of day where the air feels heavy with secrets. His name was Thomas Reed, a freelance journalist who wrote for local history magazines. He'd grown up hearing whispers of the Crowe tragedy. His grandmother used to warn the children never to wander past the old fields by the river. But Thomas wasn't a child anymore, and he didn't believe in ghost stories. He believed in facts. That belief would not survive his first night in Mill Haven. As he checked into the small inn near the harbour, the innkeeper, an elderly woman with watery blue eyes, watched him closely. When he mentioned why he'd come, she set down the guest ledger and said almost pleadingly, "There are some stories that don't want to be told, Mr. Reed." He smiled politely, the way outsiders do when they think locals are being superstitious. But by midnight, standing before the ruins of the Crowe house, with the wind tearing through the trees just like it had in 1893, Thomas Reed would realize that some legends are not simply remembered, they are waiting to be relived. Later that evening, the fog rolled over Mill Haven like a living thing. It thickened as the day died, swallowing the streets, softening the lamps until the town looked blurred and half forgotten. Thomas stood by his window at the inn, watching the mist curl around the trees across the road. The phrase he'd read that morning wouldn't leave his mind. "She's coming home." He had copied it onto a note card that now lay on the desk beside his typewriter. Mocking him in thin, uneven letters, he tried to write. Every few minutes, though, his mind drifted to that handprint on the car window. He had convinced himself earlier that it was nothing. Moisture, imagination, maybe even a prank. But as the hours passed, logic felt smaller against the weight of that whisper still echoing in his memory. It's quiet now. By 8 o'clock he couldn't sit still. He packed his camera and jacket and stepped outside. The night air was colder, the fog so dense that the inn vanished behind him after only a few yards. He walked toward Main Street, the pavement slick beneath his boots. The whole town seemed deserted. Even the diner was dark, its neon sign dead, the windows empty of the faces that had watched him the day before. The only sound came from the church bell, ringing once, sharp and low. Though Thomas knew the church had been closed for years, he followed the sound down the narrow lane that led to the churchyard. The fog twisted in strange shapes, revealing flashes of headstones, iron fences, patches of frozen grass. A single lantern burned faintly by the door. As he approached, the door creaked open slightly as if waiting for him. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and old candle wax. Wooden pews sat in broken rows, cobwebs hanging between them like lace. The bell rope swayed gently near the back of the nave, though no wind entered from outside. Thomas stepped forward, the floorboards groaning under his weight. Then he saw her. At first it looked like part of the fog had followed him indoors, drifting near the front of the church. But as his eyes adjusted, the shape hardened, tall, feminine, her outline faintly luminous in the lamplight. A woman in what looked like an old mourning dress, her face hidden beneath a dark veil. He froze. Every bone in his body told him to run, but something deeper held him there, motionless. "Who's there?" He called out. The figure didn't answer. It tilted its head slightly, like a bird studying something unfamiliar. Then slowly it moved toward him, the fabric of the dress floating as if underwater. Thomas stepped back instinctively, his heel hitting the edge of a pew. The sound echoed through the empty hall. "What do you want?" he whispered. This time the figure spoke, but the sound was not a voice. It was air soft and deliberate, brushing against the walls as though the words were being carried rather than spoken. "She's coming home." The lantern flickered violently. Thomas stumbled back, grabbing his flashlight and shining it toward the altar. But the beam sliced through nothing. The woman was gone. Only the fog remained, pooling near the pews like breath. He didn't wait. He ran out into the night, his pulse hammering in his ears. The bell rang once more behind him, deep and final. By the time he reached the inn, the fog had thinned slightly, but a new unease spread through town. Windows shuttered, doors locked, and from far off in the direction of the old fields, a faint column of smoke rose into the sky. The next morning confirmed it. Linda met him at the diner's door, worry printed across her face. "Someone set fire to the Crowe property last night," she said. "The sheriff says it was kids, but—" She shook her head. "No one in Mill Haven goes near that place anymore." Thomas joined her outside. Cars and wagons lined the street as locals whispered and pointed toward the hill, where a thin trail of grey lingered against the brightening sky. He felt a sick churn in his stomach. He had been there. He'd seen the woman. And now the ruins were burning again for the first time in more than a century. He decided to drive back out, ignoring Linda's protests. The closer he got to the property, the heavier the smell of ash and smoke became. The ground was still smouldering when he arrived, the charred remnants hissing faintly under the morning drizzle. Firemen had already gone, leaving only muddy tire tracks and silence. He walked around the foundation, careful not to disturb the unstable ground. Then he noticed something near the old step where Eliza had once sat. A small glass jar, blackened at the rim but somehow unbroken. Inside, pressed tightly against the glass, was a fragment of paper. He used his penknife to pry it out. The paper was aged and brittle, almost disintegrating at his touch. Scrawled across it in faded ink was a single line: "Do not follow her." Thomas folded it carefully and slipped it into his notebook. When he looked up, the wind shifted, and the fog began seeping back across the field again, denser, moving like a tide. It swallowed the road behind him, the trees, even his car, leaving only the faint outline of the burnt house standing amid the grey. From somewhere inside that fog came the low hum of a woman's voice, soft, almost beautiful, humming a tune that felt familiar, though he couldn't place it. Margaret Crowe used to sing while she cooked. The thought hit him like a blow. He called out, his voice cracking against the mist. "Who's there?" No answer. Just the humming, shifting closer, deliberate now, circling him. Then faintly he heard something else, a child's laugh, quick and fleeting. He turned, flashlight shaking in his hand, trying to locate the sound. The field seemed endless, spinning around him, his heartbeat echoing louder than his own footsteps. When the laughter came again, closer this time, he saw movement in the fog, small, darting shadows too low to be adults. He caught sight of a pale hand disappearing behind a stump, then another and another. He realized with a cold jolt that he was surrounded. "Samuel?" he asked, not even certain why he said it. The humming stopped. The laughter stopped. The fog fell silent. He took one step backward. From behind him came a voice he knew all too well, the same whisper from the night before. "It's quiet now." The beam of his flashlight flickered, then went dark. When he came to, it was late afternoon. His car was parked where he'd left it, but his recorder and camera were gone. Mud covered his boots. On the driver's seat, resting neatly as though placed there, was his notebook. The old jar sat beside it, now empty. He drove back to town in silence, numb and exhausted, unsure whether he had dreamed the entire thing. But when he passed the first cluster of houses, he noticed people standing outside, staring toward the woods. Some were praying. Others wept. "What's happening?" he asked Linda when he reached the diner again. She looked past him, her eyes wide and glistening. "You didn't hear?" she whispered. "A little girl's gone missing. She was last seen near the river this morning." "Said she was following someone." Thomas turned toward the north road, toward the fog-heavy trees that led to the Crowe property. "She said she was following a woman dressed in black," Linda finished, her voice breaking. Outside, the church bell rang again, carried faintly by the wind. Later that evening, the fog rolled over Mill Haven like a living thing. It thickened as the day died, swallowing the streets, softening the lamps until the town looked blurred and half forgotten. Thomas stood by his window at the inn, watching the mist curl around the trees across the road. The phrase he'd read that morning wouldn't leave his mind. "She's coming home." He had copied it onto a note card that now lay on the desk beside his typewriter. Mocking him in thin, uneven letters, he tried to write. Every few minutes, though, his mind drifted to that handprint on the car window. He had convinced himself earlier that it was nothing. Moisture, imagination, maybe even a prank. But as the hours passed, logic felt smaller against the weight of that whisper still echoing in his memory. It's quiet now. By 8 o'clock he couldn't sit still. He packed his camera and jacket and stepped outside. The night air was colder, the fog so dense that the inn vanished behind him after only a few yards. He walked toward Main Street, the pavement slick beneath his boots. The whole town seemed deserted. Even the diner was dark, its neon sign dead, the windows empty of the faces that had watched him the day before. The only sound came from the church bell, ringing once, sharp and low. Though Thomas knew the church had been closed for years, he followed the sound down the narrow lane that led to the churchyard. The fog twisted in strange shapes, revealing flashes of headstones, iron fences, patches of frozen grass. A single lantern burned faintly by the door. As he approached, the door creaked open slightly as if waiting for him. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and old candle wax. Wooden pews sat in broken rows, cobwebs hanging between them like lace. The bell rope swayed gently near the back of the nave, though no wind entered from outside. Thomas stepped forward, the floorboards groaning under his weight. Then he saw her. At first it looked like part of the fog had followed him indoors, drifting near the front of the church. But as his eyes adjusted, the shape hardened, tall, feminine, her outline faintly luminous in the lamplight. A woman in what looked like an old mourning dress, her face hidden beneath a dark veil. He froze. Every bone in his body told him to run, but something deeper held him there, motionless. "Who's there?" He called out. The figure didn't answer. It tilted its head slightly, like a bird studying something unfamiliar. Then slowly it moved toward him, the fabric of the dress floating as if underwater. Thomas stepped back instinctively, his heel hitting the edge of a pew. The sound echoed through the empty hall. "What do you want?" he whispered. This time the figure spoke, but the sound was not a voice. It was air soft and deliberate, brushing against the walls as though the words were being carried rather than spoken. "She's coming home." The lantern flickered violently. Thomas stumbled back, grabbing his flashlight and shining it toward the altar, but the beam sliced through nothing. The woman was gone. Only the fog remained, pooling near the pews like breath. He didn't wait. He ran out into the night, his pulse hammering in his ears. The bell rang once more behind him, deep and final. By the time he reached the inn, the fog had thinned slightly, but a new unease spread through town. Windows shuttered, doors locked, and from far off in the direction of the old fields, a faint column of smoke rose into the sky. The next morning confirmed it. Linda met him at the diner's door, worry printed across her face. "Someone set fire to the Crowe property last night," she said. "The sheriff says it was kids, but—" She shook her head. "No one in Mill Haven goes near that place anymore." Thomas joined her outside. Cars and wagons lined the street as locals whispered and pointed toward the hill, where a thin trail of grey lingered against the brightening sky. He felt a sick churn in his stomach. He had been there. He'd seen the woman. And now the ruins were burning again for the first time in more than a century. He decided to drive back out, ignoring Linda's protests. The closer he got to the property, the heavier the smell of ash and smoke became. The ground was still smouldering when he arrived, the charred remnants hissing faintly under the morning drizzle. Firemen had already gone, leaving only muddy tire tracks and silence. He walked around the foundation, careful not to disturb the unstable ground. Then he noticed something near the old step where Eliza had once sat. A small glass jar, blackened at the rim but somehow unbroken. Inside, pressed tightly against the glass, was a fragment of paper. He used his penknife to pry it out. The paper was aged and brittle, almost disintegrating at his touch. Scrawled across it in faded ink was a single line. "Do not follow her." Thomas folded it carefully and slipped it into his notebook. When he looked up, the wind shifted, and the fog began seeping back across the field again, denser, moving like a tide. It swallowed the road behind him, the trees, even his car, leaving only the faint outline of the burnt house standing amid the grey. From somewhere inside that fog came the low hum of a woman's voice, soft, almost beautiful, humming a tune that felt familiar, though he couldn't place it. Margaret Crowe used to sing while she cooked. The thought hit him like a blow. He called out, his voice cracking against the mist. "Who's there?" No answer. Just the humming, shifting closer, deliberate now, circling him. Then faintly he heard something else, a child's laugh, quick and fleeting. He turned, flashlight shaking in his hand, trying to locate the sound. The field seemed endless, spinning around him, his heartbeat echoing louder than his own footsteps. When the laughter came again, Closer this time, he saw movement in the fog, small, darting shadows too low to be adults. He caught sight of a pale hand disappearing behind a stump, then another and another. He realized with a cold jolt that he was surrounded. "Samuel?" he asked, not even certain why he said it. The humming stopped. The laughter stopped. The fog fell silent. He took one step backward. From behind him came a voice he knew all too well, the same whisper from the night before. "It's quiet now." The beam of his flashlight flickered, then went dark. When he came to, it was late afternoon. His car was parked where he'd left it, but his recorder and camera were gone. Mud covered his boots. On the driver's seat, resting neatly as though placed there, was his notebook. The old jar sat beside it, now empty. He drove back to town in silence, numb and exhausted, unsure whether he had dreamed the entire thing. But when he passed the first cluster of houses, he noticed people standing outside, staring toward the woods. Some were praying. Others wept. "What's happening?" he asked Linda when he reached the diner again. She looked past him, her eyes wide and glistening. "You didn't hear?" she whispered. "A little girl's gone missing. She was last seen near the river this morning." "Said she was following someone." Thomas turned toward the north road, toward the fog-heavy trees that led to the Crowe property. "She said she was following a woman dressed in black," Linda finished, her voice breaking. Outside, the church bell rang again, carried faintly by the wind. By evening, the search for the missing girl had swallowed Millhaven. Lanterns flickered along the dirt roads as volunteers and deputies trudged into the woods, their shouts dissolving into the wind. Thomas stood near the edge of the field, where the girl, 10-year-old Rose Patterson, had last been seen. Her small red bicycle remained leaning against a birch tree, its front wheel turning idly in the breeze. The ground was soft with moisture, yet her footprint stopped abruptly at the edge of the fog line. Just as Samuel Crowe's had in 1893, Thomas knelt beside the prints, snapping a few photos, his hands unsteady. The sheriff, a thick-bodied man named Whitaker, approached, his expression drawn tight with exhaustion. "You're the journalist, right?" he said gruffly. "Linda told me you'd been asking questions about the Crowes. I'm just trying to understand what's happening here," Thomas replied. "Understand this," Whitaker said, lowering his voice. "You dig too deep into Millhaven's graves, you end up in one." He walked away before Thomas could answer. A search dog barked somewhere in the distance, and soon after a child's voice echoed faintly, or maybe it was a trick of the wind. The crowd stiffened, straining to listen. Then came a woman's hum, the same soft melody Thomas had heard in the fog. The sound drifted across the trees, rhythmic, haunting. For a moment everyone froze. One of the deputies muttered, "That song, it's the same one from the Crowe story." No one spoke after that. Night crept in quickly. The search was called off until morning, though some of the locals whispered that continuing after dark would only bring her closer. Thomas stayed behind. Something in him refused to leave, even as fear gnawed at his reason. He sat on the hood of his car, staring toward the tree line, replaying every part of the legend. The words came back like a spell. She took them where it's always night. He opened his notebook and wrote a single question. If Eliza didn't kill them, who did? The fog shifted, and for a second he thought he saw movement near the field, small figures darting between the birches. He blinked and they vanished. The silence deepened, thick and steady. Then a faint glow appeared deeper within the woods, a light moving. He grabbed his flashlight and followed it in. The ground softened underfoot, the air colder. His breath came out in slow pulses. The light flickered ahead, weaving between trunks like a lantern carried by invisible hands. "Rose?" he called out, no reply. Only that low hum again, carrying through the fog. He quickened his pace, tripping over roots and stones, until he reached a small clearing. The glow was gone. In its place stood the silhouette of a well, old, crumbling, half-covered in ivy. The ground sloped slightly toward it, moist with black earth. He approached carefully. Something about the well felt wrong, as though it were breathing. A faint creak echoed from below. He leaned over the rim, shining his flashlight down. The beam caught a glint of something metallic at the bottom, a small locket. Beside it, he thought he saw hair floating and a sleeve torn from a red dress. His stomach twisted violently. He stumbled back, gasping for air. Then from the darkness below, a child's whisper lifted upward, distant but clear. You shouldn't have followed, he froze. The whisper rose again, this time joined by the soft humming of a woman's voice, the same tune growing louder, circling the clearing like a current. He backed away until his shoulder hit a tree. The humming stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable, vast. Snap a twig broke behind him. He turned, flashlight trembling. For an instant he saw her, the woman from the church. The black veil fluttered around her face, her hands pale and motionless at her sides. The fog parted enough for him to see her eyes, deep grey, endless, as if reflecting a storm that had never stopped. Thomas staggered backward and took off running. Branches tore at his jacket, his boots sinking into the mud. He didn't stop until the faint outline of town lights appeared through the fog. By the time he reached his car, dawn was breaking. Every sound felt amplified, the crows, the creak of branches, his own breath. He drove straight to the police station. Sheriff Whitaker was waiting, slumped over a desk stacked with maps. When Thomas tried to explain what he'd seen, the well, the locket, the figure, the sheriff said nothing for a long time. Finally, he looked up with tired eyes. That area was searched this morning, he said. There's no well there. I saw it, Thomas insisted. There was a locket. Red cloth. You can send men there right now. Whitaker's voice lowered. That patch of woods has swallowed hunters before. You go in, sometimes it shifts. Things move. We've stopped asking why. Thomas stood in stunned silence. The sheriff leaned back in his chair. You think you're chasing a story. But maybe, Reed, the story's chasing you. He left town that afternoon, or at least tried to. By the time he reached the highway, a fallen tree blocked the road. He turned back toward Mill Haven as dusk settled once more. The sun disappeared behind thick grey clouds, and with it came the whisper song again, faint but impossible to ignore. It followed him through the streets, beneath the sound of the wind whistling between rooftops. At the inn, Linda was waiting outside, her face pale. You need to leave, she said. Tonight. The roads are closed, he answered. Then stay inside. Don't look out the window if you hear her voice. Who is she? He asked firmly. The woman in black, what does she want? Linda's eyes glistened. Not what, who, she never left this town. Every October when the wind changes, she looks for someone new to bring back what was taken. Thomas stepped closer. Who took what? She met his stare. The Crows weren't victims. They were chosen. Before he could ask anything more, a sharp knock struck the inn door behind them. Linda froze. The sound came again, soft, rhythmic, almost polite. Thomas opened the door cautiously. No one stood there, but resting on the steps was the locket he'd seen in the well, its chain tangled, the metal wet with dark water. Inside was a faded photograph of a family, the Crows. Eliza's eyes gazed straight at him, calm and cold, just like in the trial photo, except this time her lips were curved slightly upward, as if she recognized him. Linda whispered a prayer under her breath. She found you, she said. Thomas dropped the locket, stumbling back. Outside, the street lamps flickered. The fog, once thin and low, began to rise again, rolling over the houses, thickening until the entire block disappeared behind a wall of grey. The bell rang in the distance. Then came the humming, closer, stronger, weaving through the walls like threads of air. The room darkened. The hum deepened into words. It's quiet now. Thomas turned to Linda, but she was gone. The door swung open behind him, the fog pouring in like smoke. He stepped backward until his legs hit the bed. On the windowsill, written in condensation, a new message appeared slowly, letter by letter. She's already home. When Thomas woke, morning light seeped through the ruined curtains of his room. The fog had lifted, but the silence remained thick and unnatural. He barely remembered falling asleep. The floor beside the bed was damp, and footprints, small, bare, unmistakably child-sized, led from the window to the door. His mind fought to make sense of it, but every logical thread frayed upon touch. He thought of Linda, of the voice, of the message on the glass. She's already home. He found the locket still lying on the carpet. Its clasp was broken now. Inside, the photograph had changed. The Crows were still there, seated before the worn, clappered wall of their farmhouse, but another figure had joined them. In the corner, faint and out of focus, stood a man, tall, bearded, wearing modern clothes. The resemblance to him was unbearable. His own face captured where it shouldn't be. His stomach clenched and the room seemed to sway. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, something rare in Mill Haven. He grabbed his coat and ran downstairs. The inn lobby was empty. The front desk bell rang softly by itself, each chime spaced evenly, endlessly. He pushed through the door into the street, where a few townspeople stood gathered near the church. Smoke rose beyond it. He followed the trail, the acrid scent guiding him to an old mill on the edge of town. Sheriff Whitaker was already there, barking orders while volunteers carried buckets of water from the pond. The ground-level windows were blackened. Thomas approached, calling the sheriff's name, but Whitaker spun, expression sour. "You again," he muttered. "Don't tell me you brought your camera." Thomas ignored the jab. "What happened?" "Fire started inside the floorboards," Whitaker said, gritting his teeth. "Same way it did at the Crowe farm, same smell, same pattern. But there's nothing here that can burn like that." They watched as the smoke poured from cracks in the wall, moving low and steady rather than upward. It slithered, almost deliberate, forming thin trails toward the forest. Whitaker kicked at the dirt in frustration, muttering something Thomas couldn't hear. "What's under the mill?" Thomas asked suddenly. The sheriff looked at him warily. "Storage, old tunnels maybe. Nothing useful. I need to see." "You're not going anywhere near that," Whitaker said, pointing his thick finger at him. "You've stirred up enough ghosts for one lifetime." Thomas waited until the sheriff turned away. Then he slipped around the side of the mill, ducking beneath the broken boards. Inside, the smoke was warm and heavy, carrying the stench of damp wood and decay. He covered his mouth with his sleeve and descended a narrow stairwell that led below the main structure. The steps creaked under his weight, every sound echoing like thunder in the confined space. At the bottom lay a hidden basement. Wooden beams arched above him, bowed and blistered. It looked more like a cellar than storage, lined with old barrels, rusted tools, and the remains of long-rotted crates. The smoke had settled here, hanging in whirls that barely moved. He flicked on his flashlight. Something glimmered near the far wall, a metal hatch partway exposed beneath layers of dust. He crouched, brushing the dirt aside. Etched into the iron surface were faint initials. EC, he froze. Eliza Crowe. The hinge was stiff, but he managed to force it open. Beneath lay a set of limestone steps, spiraling downward into pitch-black earth. He hesitated, heart pounding. Then he descended. The air grew colder with each step. Moisture dripped from the walls. The light from his torch bounced off stone and darkness, revealing nothing familiar. At the base, the passage opened into a circular chamber. In the center stood a wooden chair facing a carved alcove. On the chair rested a small porcelain doll dressed in black. Dust covered its face, but its glass eyes glinted in the light. Behind it, words had been carved into the wall, "Where it's always night." He stepped closer. The carvings were fresh, the edges of the letters sharp. He lifted his camera reflexively, took one shot, and the flash burst bright against the stone. For a second, the entire chamber illuminated, and he saw that the walls weren't stone at all. They were lined with wooden panels, and beneath the cracks between boards, something pulsed gently like breathing. He reached out and touched the nearest seam. It was warm. Suddenly, a loud snap echoed above him. Dust rained down. He turned toward the staircase, and his blood ran cold. The door at the top had shut. A whisper uncoiled in the dark, female, melodic, the same voice that had haunted him since the church. "This is where they waited," it said. "For the dark to take them home." Thomas stumbled back. His flashlight flickered, then steadied. The air thickened. In front of him, the doll fell from the chair with a dull thud. He stared at it for a heartbeat too long. When he looked up again, a figure now sat where the doll had been. Silhouetted by darkness, motionless, hands resting on her lap. "Eliza?" he managed to whisper. The figure tilted its head slowly, almost curious. A long sigh escaped her, too calm, too human. Then a second sound filled the air, a muffled cry like that of a child, but it came from beneath the floorboards. Thomas dropped to his knees, pressing his ear against the ground. The cries grew clearer, blending with the hum of the woman's voice. He struck the boards with his flashlight. Dust exploded outward. The noise beneath intensified into chaotic scratching, small fists pounding the underside of the wood. He pulled his pocket knife, prying one plank loose. A rush of cold air hit him, carrying the smell of earth and rot. In the narrow gap below, he saw movement. Figures shifting, hundreds of them, curled and writhing. Tiny faces stared upward, their eyes blank and pale. He reeled back, gagging, stumbling toward the stairs. The woman rose from the chair, her outline radiant against the dark. "They were waiting," she said softly, "for someone to open the floor again." He sprinted up the steps, slamming his shoulder into the hatch until it cracked open. Smoke billowed in. He dragged himself out into the upper cellar, choking, coughing, his flashlight clattering from his hand. He collapsed near the doorway, gulping air. The mill had fallen silent, completely silent. When he turned back, the door he had escaped through was missing. Only solid wall remained. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs refused. Then slowly the humming began again. It came from inside the walls, spreading outward, rising, echoing until it sounded as though the earth itself was singing. He stumbled into the open field, just as Whitaker shouted his name. The sheriff reached him, grabbed his arm, and froze. Behind Thomas, the entire mill had gone dark, not burned but gone, vanished into a crater of blackened soil. "What did you do?" Whitaker demanded. Thomas tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Only one sentence forced itself out, trembling. "She's beneath us," he said. "She never left. She's been waiting." That night the fog rolled into town again, thicker, faster, unstoppable. The church bell didn't ring this time. It had melted, found later in the rubble near the shore. And from inside the walls of every home in Mill Haven came faint scratching. Too small to belong to rats, too measured to be wind. Every floor creaked like a whisper. Every whisper ended the same way. "It's quiet now." By dawn, Mill Haven was unrecognizable. The fog had thickened into a permanent veil, swallowing the entire town in colorless stillness. The streets lay deserted, the hills muffled beneath a silence so deep it seemed to press against the air itself. Not even the birds called anymore. The last sound had been the scream of a dog sometime before midnight, cut short without echo. Thomas stayed inside the inn, pacing. The locket rested on the nightstand beside his notes. He hadn't dared touch it again. All night the faint humming had drifted through the hallways, sometimes above him, sometimes in the walls, never steady. He no longer questioned if it was real. He tried to call for help, but the line was dead. The town's only road out was blocked by fallen pines, their trunks warped, bark peeled as if stripped by heat. From the window, he saw shadows moving faintly through the fog, not people. Their shapes were smaller, hunched, shuffling along the street in quiet procession toward the church. He grabbed his notebook and walked outside. The air was heavy, metallic. Each breath tasted of smoke and wet stones. The closer he moved to the church, the more he felt the vibration in the ground, a slow, rhythmic tremor that pulsed beneath his boots. The church doors were open. A line of townsfolk stood inside, unmoving, facing the altar. Their clothes were soaked, their faces blank and drained of color. Linda stood among them. She was humming softly, the same tune Margaret Crowe had loved once upon a time. Thomas called her name, but she didn't blink or stir. The moment his voice broke the air, though, the rest of the congregation turned their heads toward him in a single stiff motion. Dozens of eyes stared, unfocused, fog-colored. He backed away, heart hammering. "What's happening to you?" he whispered. Linda's lips moved slowly, forming words that emerged in unison from every mouth in the room. "She's home." Then, silence. The lights flickered. When they steadied again, the people were gone. The church stood empty, smelling faintly of seawater and ash. Thomas stumbled outside, gasping for air. On the steps, he found a folded piece of paper pinned beneath a stone. His name was written on it in a child's delicate hand. He opened it carefully. "Tonight at the Crowe place," it read. "Only you can close it." He stared at the message. There was no signature, but he knew the handwriting from the asylum notes he had studied, the swirling script of Eliza Crowe. The paper felt fresh, not aged, the ink still damp. By noon, most of Mill Haven had vanished. Where houses stood that morning, empty lots now stretched, their outlines fading into mist. He walked the length of Main Street, marking what remained. A shop window, a lamp-post, the outline of footprints in mud. The wind had changed again, colder, sharper. The few survivors he spotted stood like statues, staring east toward the fields. Sheriff Whitaker appeared near the corner of the general store, lantern in hand, eyes wild. "We have to leave," he called. "The fog's swallowing everything." "The road is gone," Thomas answered. "I tried." Whitaker approached, sweat mixing with rain on his face. "It's her," he said in a trembling voice. "She's inside, everyone. The council tried to bury it 100 years ago, burned the files, burned the land, but the curse wasn't the Crowe girl. It was what she saw in those fields before she killed them." Thomas grabbed his arm. "What did she see?" The sheriff hesitated, eyes glassy. "Her reflection," he said weakly. In a place that didn't have mirrors. Before Thomas could speak again, Whitaker stiffened. His neck tilted at an unnatural angle, as though pulled by unseen strings. His mouth moved, his voice no longer his own. "The door is open," he said. Then his flesh turned grey and he collapsed lifeless into the mud. Thomas stood alone. That night he returned to the Crowe property. The path was unrecognizable, the ground slick and trembling under the relentless fog. The windmill still stood, creaking and bent, turning against no breeze. The house, or what was left of it, flickered in and out of view like a mirage. 1 second ruin, the next whole and lit from within by a dull orange glow. At the center of the yard sat the old stone step. Someone had placed candles around it in a perfect circle. The flame shape stretched tall in the mist, bending toward the east. He stepped inside the circle, notebook in one hand, lantern in the other. The earth vibrated softly, then split along a fine seam. Beneath it wood, the sound of faint knocking rose upward. The same scratching he had heard under the mill floors. He knelt, touched the soil, and whispered, "Eliza?" A child's laugh answered, light and clear. Then came her voice, no longer whisper but full of strange calm. "You're late." The fog coiled tighter, forming shapes, a small girl with dark eyes, a white dress, hands folded neatly before her. She looked just like the photograph, except her hair floated around her as if underwater. She stood on the other side of the candles, smiling faintly. "It's warmer down there now," she said. "They've been waiting." Thomas raised the lantern. "What is this place?" "It's Mill Haven," she said, stepping closer. "The way it was before they forgot." As she spoke, the world around them shifted. The rotted boards of the farmhouse repaired themselves. The sagging porch straightened. The candles turned into oil lamps burning steadily along a pristine white fence. The fog drew back to reveal fields ripe with corn, just as old photographs had shown them. For a moment the town was whole again. Children laughed somewhere in the distance. Margaret's voice sang from the veranda. It felt peaceful until he noticed the sky. It was pitch black. No stars, no moon. Just endless night stretching forever. Thomas turned back to Eliza. Her eyes gleamed softly in the lantern light. "Where are we?" he asked again. She answered, "Where it's always night." Then the facade began to crack. The children's laughter warped into shrieks. The corn shifted, as though pulled from below. The lamps along the fence flickered out one by one. The darkness pressed closer, filling every inch of space left by light. Thomas backed away as the ground beneath him shuddered. "You can stop this," he shouted. "Tell me how to close it." Eliza's smile didn't fade. "It was never meant to close. I just needed someone to see again." Her form flickered, fragmenting, as though she were made of smoke. "Now the town will remember." The world around him erupted into sound, 1,000 voices crying, whispering, begging. The farmhouse burned in silent flames, its walls bending inward. The night sky began to pulse like a heartbeat, each wave of darkness rippling through the air. Thomas dropped his notebook as the soil split wide, exposing the same wooden floor beneath, breathing, moving. He leapt from the circle and ran toward the edge of the field. Behind him, the farmhouse collapsed into the earth, swallowed whole. The fog consumed the flames entirely. For a brief instant, everything went still. Then a child's whisper rode the wind. "It's quiet now." Thomas turned, but there was nothing left. No house, no candles, no girl. The field stretched empty, untouched. Only the burned grass remained shaped in the outline of a door. By morning, Mill Haven was gone from every map in Maine. Travelers passing along the coast spoke of a blank patch of land where no birds flew and no echo returned. On fog-heavy nights, fishermen claimed to hear humming carried from the shore, the voice of a woman singing to a sleeping child, while the waves answered in rhythm. And somewhere beneath the soil, where it's always night, the town waited to be remembered again. Weeks passed before anyone noticed that Thomas Reed was missing. His editors assumed he was chasing another story, lost somewhere along rural Maine's frozen highways. The town of Mill Haven, after all, had already slipped into rumor, a footnote buried in old maps. But one November morning, a fisherman trawling along the coast near Augusta dragged up something strange tangled in his nets, a waterlogged notebook wrapped tightly in oilskin. Its pages were soaked, the ink bleeding into itself, but one phrase remained legible across the first line: "She's coming home." The notebook made its way eventually to a small newspaper office in Portland, where a copy editor named Daniel Graves took interest. Daniel had started his career idolizing Reed's investigative work. The handwriting was unmistakable. He spent 3 days drying the pages in his apartment before finally reading through what he could piece together. Every page matched dates corresponding to the disappearance of Mill Haven, but the final entries stopped abruptly on October 31st, the same night nearly everything in the records of Mill Haven halted. The last page contained a rough sketch, a map, perhaps showing the coastline, a series of woods, and a circle labeled Crowe House. Beneath it, a single sentence scrawled in frantic pen: "If found, do not follow the light." Daniel couldn't shake the pull. Curiosity tugged at him like a thread that refused to break. That weekend, he borrowed his friend's truck and followed the faint directions east through forgotten county roads. Autumn had already died into winter. Frost clung to the trees, and each turn seemed to lead him deeper into a place untouched by time. When he finally arrived at where the map ended, the GPS lost signal. He stood on a bluff overlooking an empty expanse of gray field that stretched to the horizon. No town, no houses. Just silence. He left the truck and walked down the slope. The air was unnaturally still. No wind, no rustle from the trees. He expected at least the smell of salt from the ocean, but the air tasted hollow, metallic. A faint trail of broken cobblestone cut across the grass, the only hint of something once built here. He followed it step by step, until a shape began to emerge through the thin haze, a church steeple leaning slightly, half buried by time. Daniel's pulse quickened. He approached cautiously, brushing frost from the warped door. The hinges groaned as he pushed it open. Inside, the pews had rotted to splinters, but sunlight filtered through the broken windows. Dust floated like snow. He noticed engravings near the altar, faint outlines carved into wood. The initials HCMCSC and EC. He recognized the names instantly from Reed's notes: Henry, Margaret, Samuel, and Eliza Crowe. He felt a strange kinship with Reed at that moment, a quiet understanding of obsession. The air in the church was cold enough for his breath to plume in white clouds. He moved toward the altar, setting his camera on the pew. When the shutter clicked, the sound echoed unnaturally long, bouncing off the walls like a heartbeat. Then faintly, he heard humming. It came from the left side of the church, behind what looked like a boarded doorway. Slow, melodic, unmistakably feminine. Daniel's rational mind told him to leave, yet his feet moved toward it. The board seemed freshly nailed despite the church's decay. He raised the crowbar from his bag and pried one loose. The air that gusted out was freezing, sharp enough to sting. The humming stopped. In its place came a whisper. "You found it." He shone his flashlight into the gap. Behind the boards, a narrow passage sloped downward. At the end, he saw a faint glow, the light Reed had warned about. He should have stopped then, sealed it again, driven back to Portland. Instead, he climbed through. The tunnel descended deep, stone walls slick with moisture. The light grew brighter ahead, pulsing rhythmically like breath. It led to a cavern small enough for him to touch both sides if he reached out. The glow came from a single oil lantern, resting on a table covered in dust. Beside it lay another notebook, newer, its cover stamped with initials. TR. He flipped it open carefully. The first pages were blank. The middle, however, contained sketches of the same church, the same altar, but drawn with meticulous detail. In the corner of one page, a small addition, a dark, indistinct shape standing behind the artist, almost unseen. The temperature dropped suddenly. The flame in the lantern flared, then steadied. Daniel turned around. At first, he thought his eyes deceived him. But she was there, a young girl standing in the tunnel entrance barefoot, wearing a white dress so faded it nearly blended with her skin. Her eyes were dark as wet stone, her expression serene. "You shouldn't be here," she said. Daniel swallowed hard. "Who are you?" "You know my name?" "Eliza." She nodded faintly, then looked past him toward the notebook. He wouldn't leave either. "He's with them now." He backed away, his hand brushing the lantern. The flame sputtered but did not die. "I came to find him," he managed to say. "You did," she whispered. "He's everywhere you stand." Daniel followed her gaze downward and saw footprints forming in the dust, fresh and heavy, crossing between them. Large prints like those of a man. He stumbled back, dropping the notebook. From the tunnel behind, more footsteps followed, dozens of them echoing closer with every breath. Eliza reached out her hand, voice soft but urgent. "Don't look at the light," he turned anyway. The glow at the far end of the cavern had intensified into a white brilliance so fierce it erased depth. For a brief moment he saw shapes suspended within it, faces, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, mouths open as if mid-song. Then everything went dark. When he woke, he was outside. The sky was grey, his truck still parked on the bluff. His wrists were raw with dirt, his nails broken. There was no church behind him, only a grassy field untouched by footprints. The notebook lay on the ground beside him. He opened it with shaking hands. The pages were empty, except the last one. In his own handwriting were 6 words he did not remember writing. She said, "It's quiet now. Back in Portland." Daniel tried to explain what had happened, but no one remembered Mill Haven. The archives listed no such town. Old newspaper records stopped decades earlier. Even the coastal maps from the 1800s showed nothing where his compass had led him. Each attempt to verify Reed's existence ended the same way. The files were blank, replaced by water stains or misfiled under names that didn't exist. Nights became unbearable. Sometimes he woke to find his apartment fogged, as if he were breathing underwater. His phone rang once at 3:17 a.m., displaying only static on the line, followed by a child's faint humming. One evening, desperate, Daniel returned to his notes. He stared at Reed's last written warning, "Do not follow the light." He flipped the notebook open again, searching for proof, but the pages were different now. On one, written in soft pencil, was a sketch of his own apartment window, and in the window, a small girl drawn in perfect detail, smiling through the glass. At dawn, neighbors heard the steady creak of the floor above their heads, like someone pacing, then briefly humming before the sound faded completely. When police arrived hours later, they found the apartment empty except for Reed's notebook open on the table. The ink had dried into 3 simple words. "It's quiet now." Months later, no one in Maine spoke of Mill Haven, and no one looked for Daniel Graves. The police listed him as a missing person, another journalist who had gone too far into the empty corners of the coast. But rumors persisted among fishermen, who swore that some nights when the tide receded, they could see the outline of a town beneath the shallows, a bell tower, a windmill, and a single figure standing on shore, waving into the darkness. In late spring, a cartographer named Evelyn Moore received an anonymous envelope at her office in Bangor. Inside was a small roll of film undeveloped, along with a typewritten note reading, "Document number 93, Eliza Crowe." The handwriting on the envelope belonged to no one she recognized, but curiosity overcame hesitation. That weekend, she developed the negatives in her darkroom. The photographs were strange but hauntingly clear. They showed faint outlines of fog-laden fields, a half-buried church, and what appeared to be an old farmhouse. One frame, however, froze her. It was a portrait of a man standing by a lantern, his features obscured by shadow, but the handwriting scribbled beneath the photo read, "Thomas Reed, 1893. That was impossible. The notation placed the image almost a century before photography reached that clarity. Certain she'd stumbled upon a forgery, she dug further into state archives, seeking any mention of Mill Haven. The files had long been locked, but a half-rotted ledger in the basement of the archive bore the name Crowe Settlement. Every page was dated before 1900. Every entry scratched out except 3 words on the final sheet. Closed for containment. She carried the ledger back to her apartment. That night she spread the pages, photographs and notes across the table, trying to map what she had. Outside, rain whispered against the windows. At midnight, the power cut out. The apartment drowned in darkness, leaving only the hum of wind from the sea. Then came the smell of salt. Sharp, raw, unmistakable. Evelyn stepped to the window. Fog had swallowed the street, thick, rolling alive. Shapes shifted within it, silhouettes dragging themselves slowly along the road. She turned from the glass, heart pounding, but the sound of humming filled the room. At first faint, then unmistakably close, right behind her. She spun around, flashlight trembling in her grip. The light caught on wet footprints trailing across her hardwood floor, leading toward the table. They stopped at the photographs. The picture labeled Thomas Reed was damp now, bubbling at the edges, the ink bleeding. She leaned over it and saw the man's face had changed. The features were clearer now. Her own reflection stared back at her, eyes hollow. The flashlight slipped from her hand. The beam rolled across the wall and froze on something that hadn't been there before. A doorway taking shape where solid plaster had been moments ago. Beyond it, faint lamplight flickered. A single voice spoke from the other side, calm, familiar female. "You took their map. Now follow it." Evelyn stepped hesitantly forward. Behind her, the sound of dripping water echoed from nowhere. She crossed the threshold and entered a corridor that smelled of wet earth. The walls pulsed faintly as though breathing. A headlight glimmered and then vanished, like a lantern swinging in unseen hands. She walked, notebook still in hand, calls of distant children appearing and vanishing with every few steps. The corridor opened suddenly into open field. She gasped. The air was the same frigid dampness described in Reed's notes. A pale full moon hung low, painting the ground in silver. In front of her stood the Crowe farmhouse, intact, with windows lit as if someone waited inside. She moved closer, whispering to herself, "This can't be real." The front door creaked open before she could touch it. Inside, the scent of apples and kerosene filled the air. A fire glowed quietly in the hearth, casting gentle light over 4 dusty chairs arranged around the table. On one of them lay a child's doll with porcelain eyes. On another, a man's coat hung neatly, untouched by time. Footsteps creaked overhead. Evelyn turned toward the staircase. "Hello?" she called. "Is anyone here?" A voice answered from the top of the stairs, a child's, soft but steady. "He said you'd come." She looked up. A small girl stood at the landing, barefoot, her dress white, her eyes reflecting firelight. "Are you Eliza?" Evelyn asked. The girl nodded once. "They keep coming," she said. "They never listen." Evelyn swallowed hard. "Listen to what?" "To the quiet." With those words, every candle in the house extinguished simultaneously. The darkness that followed wasn't empty. It breathed, whispered, closed around her like a tide. Through the muffled black, Evelyn felt fingers, small and cold, brush her wrist. A voice near her ear murmured, "You can map it, can't you? You can draw what's missing." Pain shot through her head. Images flashed, roads twisting into voids, rivers that moved backward, the sky folding in on itself until it resembled water. She dropped to her knees, clutching her temples as the voice continued. No longer just Eliza's, but dozens overlapping, a chorus of everyone who'd vanished into this story. "Finish what he started," she screamed, and the world tilted. The next morning, fishermen found Evelyn's car abandoned by the river, about 20 miles north. Inside was her bag and a rolled sheet of paper, an unfinished map drawn in charcoal. It showed the Maine coastline as usual, except one stretch near the eastern cliffs was marked differently. A perfect circle etched in dark ink, labeled only as Crowe's Hollow. All attempts to photograph it failed. The image blurred every time the lens captured that section. Months later, the map appeared in an exhibit on local folklore, displayed behind glass at a coastal museum. Visitors often reported hearing faint humming when they paused in front of it. Some said the ink glistened under certain light, forming the shape of a little girl standing at the edge of the drawn town. Late one night, the museum guard making rounds noticed something odd. The map had changed. The circle labeled Crowe's Hollow was gone. In its place, new handwriting appeared, neat and calm. "It's quiet now." He locked the gallery behind him, shaken, and returned to the security office. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.